9 waves have crashed upon the shore, 9 waves have crashed, and 9 waves more since the days of which we speak. Days when the Fionn were the boast of all Ireland, that brave, wild, fierce body of men who defended the land and the tribes when brigands threatened and other forces menaced the people of Ireland. They lived in the summer like stags in the forest, clashing antlers with one another, adventuring and roistering, and in the winter they lived like wolves in a cave with their loved ones. And in the days of which we speak, they were led by Fionn MacCool, wisest and most noble of all of their leaders, druid and warrior to the very core. And amongst this very body of august people, many a year ago, we told you the tale of how Fionn MacCool had met Siobh, the mysterious deer woman from the land beneath the land, of how she had emerged in the guise of a deer, of how Fionn's 2 dogs, Ran and Skillan, had found her, had led their master to her, of how she had assumed the form of a beautiful woman, and Fionn had fallen in love with her and been with her for many a year, until that dark day when she, heavy with child, the forces of the land beneath the land had lured her back and trapped her in that very world, and he had thought her lost and gone from him forever. Until after 7 long years had passed, she managed to escape, but temporarily, and bring her son, the son he had never seen, to meet with the father that the boy had never seen. When very first Fionn clapped eyes upon the child of his loins, that boy was in the shape of a fawn, just as his mother was in the shape of a doe. And it was only when father laid hand upon son that the boy transformed back into a human guise. And they called him Oisin, the little deer. And Oisin grew with his father. He missed his mother, who had to return to the land beneath the land. But he grew with his father, courageous and brave and bold, and adapted to the ways of the mortal court, even though all he had ever been used to was the strange and mysterious ways of the land of the Shield, of the fairy people. And he grew in fame like his father, became as renowned a warrior, as renowned a hunter, as renowned a master of the druidic arts as his father had been. But when you are a creature of 2 worlds, a union of 2 different bloodlines, human and fairy, mortal and immortal, you stand astride 2 different lands. And the blood of one calls to you when you are amongst the blood of the other. When that boy had dwelt in the land beneath the land, he had often dreamed of his father's world. And when he lived in the land of mortals with his father, he often dreamed of the land of his mother beneath the world, the land of the she, of the shapeshifters, of the people, of strangeness and magic. And still it was as he became a young man that blood would call to blood. And perhaps it is no great surprise that it was a woman of the other world that dreamt of him. Now, she was not a woman of the land beneath the land. She was a woman of a whole different realm of fairy. She was a woman of the land that is beyond the 9th wave to the west. That far distant land that is, some say, an island in the ocean, and some say a very bubble, a world beneath the waters. But whatever it may be, and wherever it may be quite located, Niamh, which was her name, dreamt night after night after night of a handsome, bold, brave, fierce man, a stag man, not quite human, not quite deer, but a mixture of the 2, a man with the legs of a stag, hairy and ending in hooves and great antlers stretching from his head, a man with the heart of a wild beast of the forest, and yet with the mind and the intellect of a human. She dreamt and she dreamt and she dreamt, and she knew that no other man, not of her kind nor of the mortal kind, would be enough for her. She wanted this magical man of her dreams, this Oisin who had come to her in a vision. And so she turned to her own magical arts to divine where he might be. And she dreamt of him stood upon the beach, a beach far to the east of where she lived. And so she called for her horse, a wondrous horse, a white horse, white as the foam of the ocean wave breaking upon the shore. And this horse was possessed of the ability to ride not only upon land, but upon water. And when she mounted the back, Niobe of the golden hair, her long tresses flowing in the wind behind her, rode out across the land of the fairy, and the horse's hooves hit the waves of the ocean and continued to ride and to ride and to ride as if upon solid land. And after many a long mile, for there is a great distance between the ninth wave and the land, she came within sight of Ireland. And there, as she came closer, she could see tiny figures upon the beach, which grew larger and larger the closer and closer she and the horse became. And on the beach itself, there was Oisin, with his companions, his friends, the loyalist brothers of his heart, brothers not of blood, but of kinship. And they were enjoying a day at the beach, a day off from the duties of being warriors and hunters and fierce brave defenders of the land, when lo and behold, to the west they saw riding towards them what looked like a horse. But how could there be a horse upon the wave? And yet the closer and closer it got, the clearer and clearer it became that this was indeed a horse, a magical horse, a wondrous horse, a horse of the ocean. And astride its back was a woman dressed in blues and greens, the colours of the ocean, the colours that the Irish call glass, flowing around her, and her hair was as gold as the corn on a summer's day, in long great plaits and tresses behind her. And at length the horse arrived on the shore, and Niobe looked amongst the gathered throng of men, and at once she knew who Oisin was. For he was the very image of the man of whom she had dreamt. And none of these other men, handsome and brave and bold though they were, none of these other men were Oisin. None of them could match the man of whom she had dreamt. And she called to him, and she introduced herself, that she was Niobe of the golden hair, and he introduced himself, Oisin, son of Finn McCall and Shar. Well, he saw her, she saw him. They were in love. The union was made there and then in their hearts. And she said to him, "Will you come with me to my world? For I cannot dwell long in your world without suffering terrible consequences." And Oisin gave momentary thought to it. And whilst it was heavy upon his heart to leave his father, whom he had only come to know in late childhood, to leave his brothers, his friends, his companions of the heart, those he had fought alongside, those he had defended the life of, those who had defended his life in battle, he knew that he could never be content, at peace, to understand inner harmony. For the word she describes not only the people of the world beyond, but the very notion of peace itself. He could not know that unless he went with Niobe to whichever world it was beyond. And he said to her, "May I visit my own people from time to time?" And she said, "Of course. What wife would deny her husband the chance to see his own people?" And so, asking his companions on the beach to pass on messages to his father, he embraced each, bid them farewell, and climbed upon the back of the horse with the woman with the golden hair. And the horse turned around to face the west, and out across the ocean wave it rode, the spray coating them as it went, mile after mile after mile, further and further and further, and there in the west he could see the sun going down, until he thought surely they must plunge into the darkness of the ocean and drown, for he had never been a great swimmer. But just as he thought all would be lost, and he began to worry that the horse was leading them astray, there opened before them a world that can only be seen if that world itself wishes to be seen. And there the horse arrived in the harbour of this new island, of Tir nOg, the land of the ever young. And when the horse had come to rest, sweating and huffing and puffing from the length of the journey, nOg dismounted and the Oisin dismounted, and his foot touched upon the soil, and there was a bonding between the Oisin and Tir nOg in that very first footstep. Well, nOg took him on a guided tour around the land of the ever young. She showed him trees the like of which he had never seen before, greater, bigger, with vaster canopies than he had ever seen before. And they seemed, many of them, to be in blossom and in fruit and in bud, all at the same time on different branches. And the fruit was of a type that he had never tasted before or never seen before. Things that looked like apples but were silver to look upon, and had the weight and the solidity of actual solid silver, but the taste of ambrosia, a taste that cannot be described, like the sweetest, finest, rarest of meads. And the aromas of the blossom were like fragrances from some far distant exotic land. And there, amongst the great trees, were flowers the like of which he had never seen, in colours he couldn't even begin to put names to. And there, alongside creatures that seemed familiar, wild boar and crows and owls and fish in the river and deer and wolves, there were other creatures which he could not name, until nOg told him their names and explained to him what they were. Strange, magical, wondrous creatures. And even the creatures that he could put names to were different. Some of them were much, much larger. The cats were the size of, well, tigers, except of course he had never seen a tiger in his life and could not make that comparison, but they were enormous. And the dogs were all white-furred, except for their paws and the tips of their muzzles and the tips of their ears and the tips of their tails, which were all as red as newly spilt blood. And likewise the cattle were enormous and the same colourings as the dogs. The things that seemed familiar were not familiar. And in time he met the people of the land beyond the ninth wave. And they were as strange and wondrous and as beautiful and enchanting as his wife. Human, but not quite human. Taller, more beautiful, and some of them had features about them that were more animal than human. Eyes like wolves or cats or owls. Some had feathers and some had fur. Some had tails and some had wings. They were strange and wondrous beings to behold. And in due course, the Oisin met the family of nOg, her brothers, her sisters, her parents, and they welcomed him with open arms. And a great wedding was held, and the druids of the land beyond the ninth wave conducted the ceremony, and pledged their 2 hands together. 3 years passed, and each year nOg fell pregnant and gave birth to a child that had the beauty and the wonder of the mother and the nobility and the courage and the fierceness of the father. 2 boys and a girl, one after the other. And he named them Oscar, friend of the deer, and Fionn, after his father, the blessed one, and Plurn and Man, the flower of womanhood. And they were happy for those 3 years, but happiness and pain can coexist in the form of nostalgia. For Oisin dreamt at nights of home. Each time one of his children was born, he longed to show that child to his father, to the mother he had not seen in many, many a long year. He wanted to show them to the brothers of his heart, to be a proud father and show them to his own kin as well as to his wife's kin. He imagined the conversations that they would have. He imagined sitting and playing games of fission with his father, a game like chess around a board. He imagined the conversations they would have, the tales they would tell. He wondered what braveries, what battles, what adventures his fathers and the brothers of his heart had had in the 3 long years since he had last clapped eyes upon them. And at length, he said to his wife one night in pillow talk of his yearnings, of his wish to see his fathers and his friends, his father and his friends. And at first nOg was non-committal. But night after night he spoke of it, and he said to her at length, "Is there a way in which I can go and see them?" And she relented and said, "Yes, there is. You may take the horse that I rode to first meet you upon the great shores of your western land. And you may ride over the oceans, and you may ride over the land, until the horse will find where your father is and where your brethren are, and you may talk with them, and you may drink with them, and you may rejoice with them. But, my loved one, my beloved, my husband, the one thing you must never do is set foot upon the land. You must remain always in the saddle. You cannot dismount, for if you dismount, problems will befall you. Terrible fate will befall you. I know it, I've dreamt it, I've seen it." And Oisin, "It will be strange to only converse with my father and my brethren from a horseback, but if that is the way it must be, that is the way it must be, and I do yearn to see them again. And I would like to take the children to see them." But she said, "First, just go meet with them by yourself, and then on a future occasion, when the children are a little older, you can take them, to see your family." And so this is what happened. The very next morning, the horse was sent for and saddled up. Oisin bid farewell to his wife, to his children, to his in-laws and his friends in the new land, and across the ocean wave he rode. And whilst he did not know the way, the horse knew the way, and guided him upon the great journey, hooves splashing upon the waves of the sea. And at length they arrived in Ireland, and the horse wandered first to the east, and then to the west, and then to the north, and then to the south. And the horse seemed agitated. It seemed disconcerted, and Oisin wondered if the horse was meandering because his father and his brothers, as so often was the case, were themselves travelling. Maybe sometimes they were going this way, so the horse would go that way, and sometimes they were going the other way, and so the horse would go the other way. But even on their wanderings through the land, he noticed things were not as he remembered them. And He had been in the world beyond the ocean wave for 3 years. There would naturally be changes, but the changes were very marked changes. He remembered passing a great standing stone from he'd known for many a long year, and that standing stone was on the edge of a great forest, except that great forest was now a third the size it had once been. Half the trees had gone. And there were houses here and there, and the houses were odd to look upon. They were not the style that he was familiar with. They were not the round houses he had known all of his life. Some of them were square and some of them were rectangular. They were of strange design. And when he would glance people coming out from these houses, that they were still people, but their manner of dress was different, was not what he had been familiar with. Be they rich or be they poor, their style of clothing was different. And he passed a place where he knew full well there had once been a great ancient stone circle, erected so long ago that even the Druids, whose memory goes back aeons, even they had no recollection of who had first put those stones there, although they had continued to worship and reverence in those stones. And yet, where those stones had once stood, they were no longer. There were 1 or 2 broken stones tipped over, but most of them had gone. And he could not imagine who would desecrate this ancient circle in such a fashion. Had there been some raid by some enemy that had decimated the land in the 3 years he had spent beyond the ocean wave? He did not know. And at length he heard some grunting and shouting and calling from a little further ahead, and he rode up with the horse, and there were a bunch of strangely dressed men, rather raggedly dressed. He assumed they were probably peasants, trying to pull this ancient stone from the earth with ropes. And they were grunting and sweating and shouting at each other and pushing and jostling, doing a very poor job of it. And it looked as if the stone at any minute would probably fall over and land on one of them and crush them to death. And so Oisin, being a noble soul, a helpful soul, rolled up to them and said, "Would you like a hand with this?" And the men looked up at him and they stood, and there was an awkward silence as rather slack-jawed they looked him up and down at the strange and wondrous horse that was as white as snow, with a mane as golden as corn, and at the strange and ancient dress this man wore, in colours and patterns and tartans and stars they had not, well, ever seen. But at length they said, if you are willing to give a hand would be given. Will you not come down and help push and shove? And he was almost about to when he remembered his wife's warning and said, I will not dismount, but tie this rope around the stone and I will hold the other end, and with the horse we will pull this way and you push that way. And so it was that they pulled and they pushed, and at length the stone, like a tooth being pulled by a dentist, came out of its hole, and the men cheered. But in the instant of pulling, the weight and the pressure of the stone caused Oisin to tip in the opposite direction out of his saddle and fall on his backside upon the land. And at once the men rushed round to help this clearly very wealthily dressed man who had fallen from his horse, and as they bent to pick him up, they froze in their tracks. For where a second before there had been a tall, powerful, muscular, handsome man in full vigour of manhood and youth, now dressed in the self-same clothes, was a man who could have been 100 if he was a day. Ancient, withered, toothless, hardly any hair at all, and what hair he did have was as white as snow, with wrinkles as deep as the gulches in the earth, and eyes that were as bleared over as rendered them virtually blind. And they stared at him in horror, and he sat there in a state of horror, looking at his own wrinkled, gnarled, knotted, rheumatic hands, where a second before had been strong, powerful, muscular hands. And the horse gave a sad whinny and turned and rode off, disappearing beyond towards where the ocean was. And the workmen, helped this frail old man to his feet, and they didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to do. And they said to themselves, "We must go and seek counsel of the great wise one." And the old man said, "Do you mean your druid?" And the men said, "Druid? We haven't had druids in Ireland for hundreds of years." "No, we mean the abbot." And the frail old man said, "Well, what is an abbot?" And they tried to explain it to him, that an abbot was the leader of a community of monks, and then they had to explain what monks were, and then they had to explain what a church was, and then they had to explain what Christianity was. And the old man felt the world falling apart around him. But they carried the ancient Oisin to the monastery, to the room of the abbot Patrick, who many referred to as Saint Patrick, although he was still very much alive, albeit an old man himself by that point in time, with a long white beard. And the workmen explained to St. Patrick everything that they had seen. And St. Patrick, at first sceptical, looked at this frail, confused old man, and then looked at his clothing, looked at the sword, the shield, the jewellery, the clasp, the silver torque about his neck, and recognised these things from ancient relics kept by the kings of Ireland. And he came to realise that these workmen were not drunk, they were not making up nonsense, that this really was a man of the ancient world. And the two fell to talking as the frail old man was laid upon a couch. And St. Patrick put many a question to him, curious to learn about the world that this old man had been in, the world beyond the ocean wave, about his wife, his children, the creatures of the Sidhe, which St. Patrick could not understand as anything other than devils and demons. But the way this old man described them, they sounded more like angels than demons. And yet how could they be angels when they knew nothing of Christ, and they devoted themselves to the ancient gods, which he had spent his life preaching against? And Oisin, for his part, questioned St. Patrick about the way the world was now. And between them they worked out that the 3 years Oisin had spent in the world beyond the wave were the equivalent of 3 centuries past in Ireland. And the tears rolled down Oisin's face for the death of his father, the death of his mother, the death of every friend and heart's companion he had ever known, the death of his father's dogs. Everything, everyone he had known and loved was gone. And not just the people, but the way of life was gone. The druids were gone. Yes, they were still kings and queens, but they sounded a poor excuse to him for the kings and queens that he had known in his life. And he could not understand how these people were so terrified of the Sidhe. Oh yes, he knew that the Sidhe were fierce and dangerous, but they were to be admired, not hidden away from by knock-kneed old men and knock-kneed old women shivering and shaking like children, terrified of the dark. And at length, as the evening drew on, Patrick said to Oisin, "Well, Christ has brought you to us. It is true that you are parted, your horse is gone, you are parted from your wife, from your children, from your in-laws, but you can know Christ. You can be accepted into the brethren. I could baptize you. You could live your life out for however long you have left in this monastery. We will feed you, we will water you, we will clothe you, we will look after you, for you are clearly too frail to look after yourself. And you can join us in singing hymns. Hymns, said the old man. Will I put eyes upon the Fina again? Will I see my brothers? Will I see my father? Will I see my mother when I die, if I accept this baptism and join you and the monks in singing hymns? And St. Patrick said, no, you will not see them again, for they are burning in hell with the unbelievers. And do you think I would prefer hymns to being with my father and my mother and my brothers in arms? You could serve, said St. Patrick, with the order. You could be as a hound of God, as a servant of God, a fierce, brave warrior of God. And will I see Bran and Skillan, my father's dogs, in heaven? No, said St. Patrick, dogs don't have souls, you silly old fool. They're dead, they're gone, they're bones and dust, you will never see them again. Then I would sooner be with the wolves in the forest, to be a wolf of the old ones, than a dog of your God. And you tell me that my father and my mother and the Fina are all in hell? Yes, said St. Patrick adamantly. And I tell you this, if my father and my mother and the Fina are in hell, they would either have overthrown the devil and taken charge of it themselves by now, or they would have escaped and gone to the lands of Tir and nOg and be there waiting for me with my wife and my children. And so I join them. And with that, Oisin laid his head back upon the cushion on the couch, closed his eyes, and died. When we can but hope he rejoined his wife and his children and his father and his mother and his blood brethren in either Tir nOg or whatever place they may now be in, and wish them nothing but joy. It's not